Welcome! In today's video, I'll be helping you to understand an example of how diffusion happens in the lungs. As you found this video, I'm going to assume that you've come across this word diffusion before, and that you already know that diffusion is the movement of molecules from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. If you're sitting there thinking, I don't really understand what diffusion is, then don't panic. I have actually made a whole separate video looking just at this question. So if that's you, then I suggest that before you carry on any further looking at diffusion in the lungs, you stop this video and go back and watch part 1 first. Diffusion is happening all the time. It's the reason we can smell a nearby pizza. And it's the reason that we can smell a spray of perfume, even if we're standing at the other side of the room. Before we look at diffusion in the lungs, let's spend a minute revising how diffusion happens. A squirt of the bottle puts particles of perfume into the room, and those particles quickly move around and spread out. At the start, all of the perfume particles are close together in one area of the room. We say that this area of the room has a higher concentration of perfume particles compared to other areas of the room. At the start, there are no perfume particles in this area of the room, so we say this area has got a lower concentration of perfume particles. So the perfume particles gradually move from this region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, and this spreading out process is called diffusion. And in diffusion, we sometimes say the particles are moving down a concentration gradient, so you'll sometimes hear that phrase. Now that we've recapped diffusion, we'll spend the rest of this video focusing on why diffusion is important for breathing. So we'll recap what our lungs look like, and we'll look at the alveoli, which are the little air sacs inside the lungs where diffusion happens. So let's get started. So welcome to BioSmash. I'm Jo, I'm a science teacher, and I'll help you smash your biology revision. When we breathe, air moves in and out of our lungs. And here's a diagram of what your lungs look like. Air is a mixture of lots of different molecules all moving around together. And one of those molecules is oxygen. So when we breathe in, oxygen enters our body. And this oxygen then travels down to our lungs. The oxygen enters the lungs by travelling down a tube called the trachea. The trachea then branches off into 2 smaller tubes, each of which is called a bronchus. So the oxygen travels down the bronchus. And the bronchus then branches off into really narrow tubes called bronchioles, and the oxygen then travels down the bronchioles. And here I've zoomed in on a section of the lung so you can see the oxygen particles travelling down the bronchiole. Now the bronchioles end in tiny little air sacs called alveoli, and if you have one of them, it's called an alveolus, so I've labelled one of them here. This diagram shows you the alveoli more closely, so I've labelled an alveolus. And each alveolus is wrapped in blood vessels, so the blood vessels bring blood to the lungs so that the blood can pick up the oxygen that's moved into the lungs and take it off around the body. I've drawn a diagram of the alveolus so that we can look at diffusion happening in more detail. This pale pink section is the alveolus, or the air sac, and the tube going into it is the bronchiole. You can also see the blood vessel which is wrapped around the alveolus, and it's got little red blood cells inside it. So the darker pink liquid inside the blood vessel is the blood, and I've also labelled a red blood cell. Red blood cells look like this, and their job is to carry oxygen around the body. The oxygen molecules bind to the red blood cell, a bit like people sitting on a rubber dinghy. So let's imagine that we've just breathed in and the oxygen is about to enter the alveolus. We now have lots of oxygen molecules inside the alveolus. Because there's lots of oxygen, we say that there is a high concentration of oxygen inside the alveolus. So let's add a label to remind us that there's a high concentration of oxygen in that part. If you look at the top of the picture, you can see I've drawn an arrow to show the blood is coming into the blood vessel and going around the alveolus. So the blood flows in at the top. And because the blood is moving, the red blood cells flow around the alveolus, a bit like the one shown in this picture. So the oxygen is inside the alveolus and the red blood cells are inside the blood vessel and they're moving around it. And remember, the blood flows through a one-way system, so it comes in at the top and then goes out at the bottom. So because the blood is moving so quickly, at any one time there's not much oxygen inside the blood. So we can say that there's a low concentration of oxygen inside the blood and a high concentration of oxygen inside the alveolus. And as we learnt about, if something's got a high concentration, it will always try to diffuse to a lower concentration. So this means that in the lungs, oxygen will diffuse from a higher concentration in the alveolus to a lower concentration in the blood. And as it diffuses, the blood carries the oxygen off so that it can be taken to where it's needed around the body. We haven't got time in this video to talk about what the oxygen does next, but if you're not sure, check out this video, which is linked below. So by now you should be able to give the alveolus in the lungs as an example of diffusion that happens in animals. As I mentioned before, this video is actually the second video in a series of 3 different videos looking at diffusion. If you watch part 1, you'll be familiar with my map. It looks like this, and each signpost is a different step in the journey to being able to fully explain diffusion. So now that we've looked at an example of diffusion in animals, the next step is to do a check-in to see how much you've remembered and whether you've understood the key points. Before we go on to that though, if you found this video helpful, then please do subscribe or click like so that other people can find the video too. Today's check-in question is a true-false question. I will give you a statement and you need to decide if it's true or false. So here's our statement. Oxygen diffuses into the alveolus from the blood. Have a read of it, decide is that true or false, and jot your answer down. And just like before, if you need a bit more time, then please do pause the video. So the answer is false, and if you keep listening, I'll explain why. As a reminder, the oxygen is in the alveolus to start with, and it's a high concentration in the alveolus, and it moves to a lower concentration in the blood. So it's actually moving in the opposite direction. So here's the incorrect statement, and here's the correct version. So the correct version is that oxygen diffuses into the blood from the alveolus. Before we finish this video, it is important that we just mention that as well as breathing in oxygen, our bodies also breathe out carbon dioxide. And if you've watched the video about mitochondria, you'll understand why. So here's a picture of carbon dioxide. And because we breathe carbon dioxide out, it moves in the opposite direction to oxygen. So you can see that the carbon dioxide is coming to the alveolus through the blood, and then it diffuses into the alveolus and out through the bronchiole. And here's a sentence describing that. In the lungs, carbon dioxide diffuses from a higher concentration in the blood to a lower concentration in the alveolus. So it's the opposite of oxygen. And because the carbon dioxide gets breathed out after it gets into the alveolus, this makes sure that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the alveolus remains low. And to draw all of that together, I've just drawn a quick sketch showing that oxygen is coming in at the same time that carbon dioxide is going out. One helpful way of revising is to memorise key sentences that you can then write down in exams. To help you with that, I've made some cheat sheets and I've put the links to these below. As I mentioned earlier, to make sure you fully understand diffusion, I would recommend you watch the other 2 videos in this series. So the next one, part 3, is looking at an example of diffusion in plants, and the link is below. If you've reached this point in the video, then a really big well done to you. We've covered loads today, so if you didn't get it all the first time, then please don't worry. Just keep watching, and the more you watch it, the more you practice the questions, the better you will get. Maybe you want to watch it once tomorrow, once the next day, until you get the hang of it. So together we will smash your biology revision. Hopefully I'll see you here soon.